So it is always a joy to take Sri Aurobindo's name under whatever pretext, anywhere, everywhere, or whatever reasons, or without any reason. So thank you for this interesting moment on 150th year of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo's life can be looked from many vantage points. For instance, his life can be looked at from a historian's perspective, academicians, philosophers, poets. These are all different angles through which we look at his life. Another perspective can be as a devotee and a disciple, as those who are aspirants for a greater life, sadhaks and yogis, budding yogis. And there is another perspective from which his life can be looked at, which comes straight from the heart of Sanatan Dharma. There are few words which we find enshrined in the Sanatan Dharma which give us a key to the entire Indian life. And Sri Aurobindo is the finest flower and fruit of that life. And some of these words which we find not only epitomized but as a living example. That was the way we had works like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad. So we understand all that we find in the scriptures right in the embodiment. And that's one way to look at Sri Aurobindo's life. I love to look at it like that. For instance, we can take some of these keywords. One of the keywords in Indian thought is Dharma. So you try to understand this way, that way. But if you read through Sri Aurobindo's life, look at his life, it's a life of Dharma. All the three meanings of Dharma are there in it. Dharma is that which holds us and that to which we hold. Never for a moment we see Sri Aurobindo slipping from Dharma. He held on to that Dharma so steadfastly, the root, the core, the stable basis of all existence. But Dharma is also something which evolves, which keeps on taking us towards greater and greater heights. And therefore, out of that sense of Dharma which is evolving, we have words like Tyag. There is always leaving the lesser for the higher, leaving the lesser for the higher. We see in Sri Aurobindo's life so beautifully, Nalini in one of his, I think it's a talk or a writing, a century's tribute to Sri Aurobindo, where he so beautifully describes that Sri Aurobindo's life, if we see, series of Tyag, but not Tyag as we understand. We mix up Tyag and Sannyas, but constantly leaves the lower and the lesser for something higher and yet higher. Of course, when we use the word lower and lesser, even Sri Aurobindo's baseline is too high for many of us. And yet we see this constant ascension. So we see the life of Dharma, he stands by Dharma, so much so that there are moments when he will be completely misunderstood. For example, when Sri Aurobindo leaves the national scene, suddenly, he was totally misunderstood. There were people who took it that he has just gone away. Sri Aurobindo didn't worry about that. He knew why he is going, because there was a larger calling. He had already done all that needed to be done. He had set into motion all the lines of forces along which India will gain independence. There was nothing more to be done at that point of time. In fact, Sri Aurobindo was far ahead of his times. So when he goes to Pondicherry and he is asked by people to come back, then Congress, I think President John Baptista, so there is a letter. And he's asked, requested, why don't you come back? And he says, if I come back, none of you will understand what I am saying. If you read his national writings, he speaks about sacrifice, which is the keynote more than Swaraj. Swaraj is the result of the sacrifice of yajna. Sacrifice is not about just... So this is Dharma. We see Sri Aurobindo's life of Dharma epitomized in his life. For the sake of Dharma, he is ready to do anything. Nothing is... no sacrifice is considered as big for upholding the Dharma. The same thing we see when he gives his assent to the Cripps proposal, when he puts his money, some money in the war fund. But it's for the sake of Dharma. It doesn't matter. People will understand, misunderstand. His own, we see, his own wife, she misunderstands at times. And yet, he's always, we see a life of Dharma. Then there is another key word in Indian thought, which is very closely allied to dharma, is adhatma. Of course, very loosely, dharma has no equivalent in English. So it's not religion. I can't translate it in English. Though it includes religion, it includes ethics, it includes morality, but it's something much greater, much deeper, much higher, much subtler. It includes the entire business of life. Everything in Sri Aurobindo's life we see. You see, a simple act when he has to give a letter to be posted. Sri Aurobindo doesn't say post it. He says, I suppose it has to be posted. This perfect gentleman, this comes from the entire, spirit of the dharma in which he has nothing for oneself, all for God. So we see that dharma and then adhyatma, which again very loosely and wrong, my own, of course, it's not spirituality. Spirituality is a very vague general word. Adhyatma is atma, of course, we know the self, and adhi, that which is higher and above. So it's a journey of ascension from the lesser to the greater and greater self. Nowhere else we can find it so beautifully characterized than in Sri Aurobindo's own life. It is adhyatma in the truest sense. That's how Shri Krishna says in the Gita, I am adhyatma, I am adhibhut, I am adhiyagna. Then there is another word which is so significant. There are many, many significant words, but one of them is vedanta, which is the end of all knowledge. If I may say so, which may sound paradoxical, Sri Aurobindo went beyond the end of all knowledge. Why? Because what we considered as the end of all knowledge was a starting point. The reason is we found the ultimate source. It is the end of all knowledge. Sri Aurobindo takes the reverse path. How is that ultimate knowledge connected with this? We find hints of it in the Gita. We find hints of it in the Vedas. But it has been lost. Sri Aurobindo once again establishes the connection. So it's Vedanta of the highest kind. I don't like to call it integral non-dualism, and all those words are absolutely, they don't do justice to what it is about. So Vedanta, if you want to see what is Vedanta, you see Sri Aurobindo and you understand what is Vedanta just by his life. And among these words, one of them which we thought, Arya. Arya was the noblest ideal of human being. He was a warrior and he was a tiller of the soil. He tilled his soil for bringing out the fruits of plenty. And he battled for the sake of light and the right to be established upon earth, within and around. We see all these, and that's why when Sri Aurobindo used certain words in the Indian freedom struggle, it was very often misunderstood. Swaraj, for example, was not just gaining independence politically, that was of course necessary, but Swaraj also meant self-rule, Swarat. The Aryan type, so beautifully we see described when Kapali Shastri comes to see him, or when we know his Baroda teacher even before that, when he comes to see him, how, meet him, and he expects a, person who is all dressed up, suited, booted, and he sees somebody in dhoti on the floor mat, and when he's asked, why are you doing this? I mean, I expected something else. He says, don't you know? This is our dharma, I'm a brahmachari. And brahmacharis are forever supposed to live like this. And such a brahmachari that apart from Sri Ramakrishna, if there is one I am aware of, there may be others. Brahmachari who was married, a grahastha brahmachari, we see Sri Aurobindo. It's there in one of his passing comments to someone. So we see all these great words fulfilled in him, taken to their utmost consummation. Yoga. Again we see there are different paths. Yoga is a word again very much misunderstood and misused. Everybody is doing yoga, so that's okay. But yoga is union with the divine. But Sri Aurobindo left no route through which you can approach the divine and unite with him, and went still further, including even the body in the yoga. This is something which is so amazing. Hatha yoga is not including the body in the yoga. Hatha yoga is you use the body as the starting point to extract that consciousness which is involved in the body, release it and take it towards union with the divine. But here he is taking the body itself to be included in the process of yoga. They're totally different things. So very often people think integral yoga means hatha yoga for the body and pranayama for the vital, and bhakti for the. They are very different from the way Sri Aurobindo has used the word. So, and then of course, one of the key word which we thought we could pick it up is yajna. His whole life can be described in this way: life of Dharma, a life of the Aryan ideal, a life of Vedanta, what a Vedantin is, if one wants to see rather than read, and a life of yoga, what yoga is, how does a yogi live, speak. Arjuna had asked Sri Krishna, and Sri Krishna gave him all the inner marks. But all the questions that he had not directly answered, because there was very little time and the context was different, Sri Krishna had surely noted down. Okay, for later, for later, for later. And then he comes as Sri Aurobindo and answers those questions, giving a living example of what a yogi can be. I'll see just one thing. There is a picture of Sri Aurobindo. I'm sure many of us have seen it in the Surat Congress. There is Sri Aurobindo is sitting. Lala Rajpat Rai is the Lokmanya Tilak. He's pointing a finger, and there is a Meli. Surendranath Banerjee is there. You almost feel what must be going on. Look at Sri Aurobindo's face. You want to understand a Jivan Mukta, here he is. And it is he who had given the command to split the Congress. Very few people know this. In Sri Aurobindo's own language, it is he who gave the command to split the Congress. Of course, we are not supposed to speak of politics, but just, since we are at it, I often say this humorously: what the Lord has split, it is going to be split again and again. Because it's a divine action. Everywhere we see, each action left the footprints of a God. If you want to understand Deva, Avatar, all of them epitomized in Sri Aurobindo. So his life, just dwelling upon his life, is the perfect example that we can ever have for ourselves. So just we take one word, yajna, such a significant word. Yajna is not, again, when we translate into English, sacrifice. So by sacrifice we think self-immolation. Somebody who offers, hears, that's the least, that's not even self-immolation. Very often it's beautification. But self-immolation is not sacrifice. Sri Aurobindo makes it very clear. In fact, if sacrifice is an act of joy and love, in fact, it is seen at one angle from one point of view. It is the most profitable transaction one can ever have. So what does one sacrifice? The lower for the higher, lighting up the flame of aspiration. And thereby, there are 3-4 levels through which we see humanity moves. The law of sacrifice is the origin of creation. To know that everything, it is the Indian way of saying oneness and interconnectedness of this universe. So whoever lives separately only for himself, the word sin, if ever we see it used in Sri Aurobindo's writings, it's for this. There's even a aphorism where he says that selfishness and meanness are the only sin I find difficult to pardon, and yet they are so universal that you have to just take it. So a life where you live as a separate being. See how different this Indian ideal is from the ideals that we receive. Living only for oneself, only for one's separate existence, to amass, to gather things, only to make one's life better. We just don't see it in the entire life of Sri Aurobindo. Even while he is there, the first sacrifice that Gita speaks of is sacrifice into the senses, and the senses into the fire of self-control. So Sri Aurobindo doesn't, I often say that if one little thing we can practice, when a whole year he goes with a penny for a saveloy and a cup of tea, I think if there is anything one can ever imagine, what was he doing at that time? And after all that, he has no resentment for his father. If you read Sri Aurobindo's, all that he has ever spoken about his father, it's always something good, something beautiful. It's something amazing. I mean, somebody else would say, you see my conditions, how I was brought up. My father didn't provide for me. Nothing. He understands. He has all that right from beginning. What a high take-on point. And then when he comes out from that place, we see that he starts preparing the ground. Because in Vedas, the first you must prepare the Vedi, then light up the fire, not prematurely, hastily. That's why Sri Aurobindo often says that in this yoga, I am not anxious to pull people, especially when they are young, because an artificial and imitative fire can be lit. You need to have a inner strength, physical, psychological, intellectual, emotional, to be able to receive that fire. It's not easy. Lighting a fire is one part, but sustaining it, it will be subject to all kinds of onslaught. So we see in Baroda what is described as a period of silent preparation. Sri Aurobindo is preparing the Yajna. So his own body becomes the altar, because this is the first altar. Humanity, its house of sacrifice. So if you look at that life period in Baroda, he started with that fire, Indu Prakash. When you read, it's like he is asking for the highest right away. Nobody is ready, even those who are there. See, all this he must have gone through. That's why in Savitri, when he reaches the seat of the Divine Mother, the highest seat, she says, what thou hast won is thine, but ask no more. Alone thou standest at the eternal doors. Man is not ready. He must have seen. That is the reason why he transited from the political field, because nobody was ready even to understand what Sri Aurobindo was saying. And what he must have felt, experienced. But even before that, we see his writings in the Indra Prakash. They are like a fire which is coming out as sparks. And it was too much at that point of time. So Sri Aurobindo starts gathering the woods. You must prepare the ground, and then you must gather the woods. Wood, that lakdi, and the samidha. So he is gathering. Slowly we see that he is preparing a whole ground. And when he is in Baroda, we know his life. There is a very interesting phrase in the Gita, which Sri Aurobindo, of course, reveals at great length, that people who earn or get things from themselves, the next level of sacrifice is when you sacrifice and you have desires, but you sacrifice. One is where you are literally looting, wanting to extract forcefully. That is, of course, a very asuric way. But there is another where you act, you offer to the, whatever, to the gods, powers that can give us, and then you receive. And then you are happy with it. You are receiving. So that's what is called as receiving rightful sacrifice. There is a third level, which is very interesting, which is... when I had read it long back, I used to wonder, what does it mean? Till I read about Sri Aurobindo's life. It was, he receives what is left from the fruits. Whatever is given, he takes the last. This was inbuilt in the Indian tradition, if I may say so. You give to the cow, you give to the crow, you give to the dog, you give to the to the god, and then you eat. So this leftover meant that you take only that which is kept for just for your needs, and the rest is given to what? Not like a tamasic way, but given for whatever at that point you conceive as something higher, more beautiful. And that we see with Sri Aurobindo's life in Baroda. He gets money. It's quite a substantial amount of money by standards of those days. What does he do with that money? He keeps it, literally, practitioner of yajna. Dravya yajna. That's the lowest form of yajna. Dravya yajna, jnana yajna, tap yajna, yogi yajna. They're all yajnas. So yajna literally means that you are not using it for selfish ends. You are keeping it for the whole. And how he would keep it? He would keep it in the open. The servants, whoever, they would pick it up. And then whatever is left for purposes, it's there. His own wife, he asks him, and then Sri Aurobindo says that I have not just one family. There are so many who are there who depend upon me. See, these are parts which we will never know. Who were those who depended on Sri Aurobindo? Whom he was offering, whom he was sharing with. These are aspects we'll never know. What were the things in which he was contributing? But one thing we know, this Dravya Yajna went to a grand culmination when he left his It's so inspiring, that whole story, that when he's called for the National College in Calcutta following the Bang Bhang, the partition of Bengal, Shubindo goes there leaving a good salary for a very small amount, which he says even that ceased over a period of time. So we have heard about Dravya Yagya. But Dravya Agya, to a point where he is not even bothering about what he will get, how he will get. Surely he was sustained. And this continued. Even in Pondicherry, his life is like that. Where he says, God has contracted a bad habit of giving me. I know he will provide, but he provides at the last moment. He says it humorously. Dravya Yagya. Then you have this Tapa Yagya, literally concentrating all the energy is focused on one goal. Whether it be during the revolutionary days, in the jail, subsequently, he is completely focused on one thing. Tap, that is the height of tap. You concentrate all, it's literally concentrated energy of spiritual endeavor. That is tap, comes from that same tap. So all the energies are concentrated on one thing. And his own life, when Milani Devi writes to him, but even there you see his Aryan self. So when Milani Devi complains, or obviously must have been a difficult time for her, Shubindo doesn't tell her, oh, you don't understand what a work I am doing, it's something very great. Nothing. All that he tells us is, you are very bholi, you are very innocent. You are carried away by what people tell you. And then he reveals what his greatest and highest aspirations are. And he asks her to come along with him. This was the perfect prototype of an Aryan. He doesn't tell her that, no, you don't join in my journey. He says, you come along. And if you come, your strength will not be diminished, but it will increase manifold. So we see that kind of an ideal where his whole life turns into a worship of the eternal. That time, anybody else would have thought, see, living for the family is a valid aim. But he has already enlarged the scope from the family to the nation. So there are these few steps. One is the family. So the little selfish life done for the family is one step, wherein we enlarge the circle of egoism. Shubindo describes it beautifully in the Doctrine of Sacrifice in his Karma Yogin writings. But obviously, family is still a small circle. Family for the sake of tribe, larger group, and tribe for the sake of nation, which is what Sri Krishna comes to teach. That kul is okay, but there is something still greater than kul. And of course, he takes to the ultimate. So, greater than tribe is the kul. And that's what we greater than kul is the nation. So, we see Sri Aurobindo by doing this was actually giving rebirth to India. Before that, we were told that, India was number of princely states. Well, having state doesn't mean you are not a nation to start with. That kind of idea that we were divided. No. Even now we have states, we have differences, we have different chief ministers. So what? Just because we use the word United States doesn't mean it's all. They have even different laws. That doesn't make a divided house. And we were all buying this. So he once again, and his way was always from within outward. So when he awakens, lights up the fire of yajna in the Indian nation, he calls for sacrifice. When we look at Bhavani Bharti, one of his first writings, what does he say? That there is a demon sitting on my mother's chest. Should I enjoy life? Is this the moment to enjoy life? Or shall I not rush to save my mother from that demon? Just to read these writings gives a glimpse of what he must be going through. And he immediately plunges into that headlong. He lights up the fire. And whenever we have in sacrifice, there is the sacrificant, the priest. There is, of course, the offering. There is the fire, and there is the deity. So the deity there is, and of course, there is the fruit. So the deity in this is Mother Durga, the deity, guardian deity of India. So we see, he lights up, and Bhavani Bharti, it starts with the deity is Mother Durga. What is the fruit he covets? Not a position for himself as, we see today's politicians. But he covets the only fruit, Swaraj, Purna Swaraj. He says, this is what we want. And so he has actually laid down everything. What is he going to offer? He says oneself. So now it's not just Dravya. He says, what does the mother demand of us? It's a very powerful writing. She wants us to be steel. She wants us to give ourselves. And when we read those writings, it's so clear that his life at that point of time, and what a one pointedness, that even when he comes to the Alipur jail, just for 2 or 3 days, he describes that condition. Otherwise, such a concentrated life that there also he is constantly, now we see Yogi Yajna, where he is constantly offering all these things into the great sacrifice to the Lord, to the divine. That all is the divine. That those verses from the Isha Upanishad, he is living by that. So if you look at his life, it starts with an individual yajna, if I may say so, during the Baroda, the early period, where he lives a life of complete giving for something higher. There was nothing which was for himself. In fact, he says in one of his letters that so far I have lived my life like a thief. And this is exactly what he describes when he explains in the Gita sacrifice, that I have kept 14 annas to myself and given 2 annas to God. That's the life of a thief. So different from our idea of ostentatious, I am giving to God this much. And it reminded me of mother's story where she says the perfect gift where, somebody came to Shiva. Shiva came disguised as a mendicant and asked a lady to give something. And this lady had eaten half and she had kept half. She says, I have only this much and I'll be very happy to give it to you. But I have only this much. And the mother says, that's a perfect gift. And best part is she didn't even know that he is Shiva. This is the kind of giving we see in his life, that all my life is meant for the sake of something higher, something greater. Even for India, when he's sacrificing to India for the sake of the Indian, this thing, he is saying it's not for itself that India is rising. It's for something much greater. This thought was always there, we find in Sri Aurobindo's writing, that this giving is not for just for India becoming independent for its own sake. It rises for the sake of the world, and the world for the sake of the divine. So constantly we see this stream running in Sri Aurobindo's life. And then when he comes to Pondicherry, of course we know what kind of life it was, moving from place to place. Now that in the Indian scenario the fire has been lit, and once the yajna has started, the gods have started coming. Indian independence was a foregone conclusion. That's why people who doubt that, will there be an Akhand Bharat? Well, this matter has been settled long back. It is a question of time. Because it has been done through the right process, and that is through yajna. Even one person aspiring for it in the true way, and Sri Aurobindo, wherever he did, that was his way. Then he engages into a cosmic yajna, larger, for the good of earth. Again, whom will he ask for sacrifice? It needs human beings. So while he is lighting up the fire of the cosmic yajna, preparing the ground, we always hear that whenever there is a yajna, in Ramayana you'll read very vividly. It's there even in Mahabharata, certain areas, there will be all these asuras and rakshasas will come. Tadka will come with her, socialistic ideas of life. Then, there's a reason why I'm saying so, but not going into it. She will come with those ideals, No. Everybody, we are all equal. Do that without understanding the real sense. Yes, we are equal in the deep essence of things. Then there will be others who will come to destroy the yajna. So First World War is the attempt to destroy this yajna bhumi, because the mother had come. But you see how beautifully the mother turns even that into a yajna by offering her own body. If you read through the mother's prayers, in fact, their birth itself is a yajna, if you see, sacrifice. But when we read the mother's prayers, where she says her own body she has offered as a holocaust. And there was a whole movement where she was experiencing in her own body all the nations and all that was happening in the war, she was experiencing on different spots of the body. She had literally become like Sati, to be reborn as Parvati. That phase we see that on one side she was engaging into this cosmic yajna in one way, and Sri Aurobindo was that time engaged in what can be known as the Gyan Yajna. He was releasing idea forces, and I have a military image for it. See, in military image, there is a ground level which is war is taking place. So the infantry is fighting. That's called eyeball to eyeball contact. Then there is the artillery. Just bear with me this image because I have actually seen it. So it's very interesting. And then there are the airplanes. So on ground, these people were fighting all over the world. Then there were big people sitting and planning. But Sri Aurobindo at that point of time was sending spacecrafts and aircraft into that world, completely covering it with those ideas, forces which are going to transform the world. And it is then that we see in those troubled times he was releasing Savitri. 1916 is the time when the first official draft of Savitri as Savitri started. So he was engaged in that kind of yajna. Anybody else, I am sure it's such a lesson for us when people are all the time asking, what will happen in the Russia-Ukraine war? What will happen in this and that? Here is Sri Aurobindo. There is a world war going on at that point of time. Later on he involves himself, but that too at a different point of time. But Sri Aurobindo is busy going far ahead as to what this world will do once the war is over. And I have a feeling that the League of Nations which came into existence was a result, was the fruit of this sacrifice. He was releasing the ideal of human unity. One cannot even imagine. Of course, then it went through successive changes, and obviously it's yet undergoing the changes. But that is the fruit of sacrifice he was asking through the Gyan Yajna, that there should be unity but on a true basis. All the frivolous basis of unity are not going to work out. This is something which we see very clearly in Sri Aurobindo's writings. Any effort to create unity without finding the true center will not work out. We may try it. We may have all the meetings. We may have all the, Bonhomie, group programs. All that is fine. We can do it. But unless we discover the true basis, that's what Sri Aurobindo's life teaches us. And then, of course, after this, we see something still greater. You see, when the Divine Mother arrives, she starts drawing, her whole body becomes a Yajnavedi, and she starts drawing all the darknesses, all the forces into herself. It's like she was ready to do a Purna Ahuti. She felt so sick. The only time people saw Sri Aurobindo a little serious. And when people asked him, what has happened? And he says that she has started taking out of her immense love all the children's miseries of the world into herself. And there is a very interesting prayer of the mother which Sri Aurobindo quotes during that in one of his letters. She had asked the divine, read that prayer, let all the desires of the world come into me. She had asked the divine that let all the difficulties and challenges come into me. I don't want my children to suffer. And she was taking it. It went to that point where Sri Aurobindo had to intervene. We know number of stories of those moments. And because of this great sacrifice, cosmic yajna, the gods started coming. We read this in all these literature of sacrifice. Yajna, when it is conducted, all the gods start coming. And first the asuras come, then the gods come. So first the titans came. What did they do in the process? They ploughed the earth. First World War is the coming of the titans, ploughing the earth. And then we see the gods started coming. After that we see the meditations and all the gods would come. And there are number of wonderful anecdotes and stories of the mother with the gods. One of them is very interesting. I mean, it's a bit humorous. When she was one day saying, there's nothing like, she was speaking of humanity that is so wonderful, and she was speaking of music. And she's saying that some of the gods of the Puranas. And the next day, all the gods came to her, or the same day. She said, but we have music. So Krishna with his flute and Saraswati with her veena. And she says, all of them came to me. Look here, we have music. What she was expressing was something else. The human speech can climb to a level. The mantra, the highest intensity to which human speech is capable. So she is, releasing these things. So after the Titans, the gods come and a new world can be created, a god-like world. Manav. But Sri Aurobindo, sacrifice what? Offering the lower for the higher. So what can be greater than Deva Manav? And she goes to Sri Aurobindo and says, I have created a Deva Srishti with Deva Manav. You see, gods were descending into the disciples. Amrita, Brahma, Varuna in Nalanida and many others. God started descending. And Sri Aurobindo says, we will create a religion which is greatest of all religions, but this is not what we want. So we have heard about renunciations, but Mother within 2 hours removed all this. Why? Because the plan was not Deva Manav. Deva Manav is a halfway home. The plan is Divya Manav, a divine creation, not a godlike creation. This is the original plan. And Sri Aurobindo wanted to complete it. Because we see in Ken Upanishad these 3 levels at which creation operates. One is the ordinary life, given to senses, what I see is true, what I hear is true. There is another Deva, the sense behind the sense, the eye behind the eye. And then the gods are very happy because they are the ones who are motivating these senses to function. Then there is the eternal who comes and says, no, wait. There is something still greater. It hints at that. It doesn't complete that process, but it hints. So we see that not Deva Manav, but Divya Manav. What she calls is the overmind creation and removed. And then there is a hard work. Now the Yajna has to be created once again, but much deeper. The foundations have to be much deeper. Already human beings have come who are now ready to become the stones, bricks. That's why these early pioneers, we may understand, may not understand them. It's a different thing altogether. But they are special. When Rama went for battle with Ravana, he didn't call the army from Ayodhya and Magad. That's okay. That was his greatness. But the only people who came were the Vanaras. They came from Kishkinda. So they are special. They were gods who had incarnated as, Vanaras to participate in the work. So something similar we have to understand that, when he started the cosmic yajna, yes. So the cosmic yajna, when he started, the ground has to be prepared. Exactly, much more stable, solid foundation. So otherwise it'll break down. When the divine descends, not the gods, we can't bear it. So we see from 1926 onwards, a different foundation. Then disciples start saying, I am feeling obscure, I am feeling dull. And Sri Aurobindo say, yes, the consciousness descended into the physical, then in the subconscious domains, all these letters. And then, of course, once again, when the forces see that, he is going to create Divya Srishti, not Deva Srishti. Their work has been foiled already first. So there is a second wave of attack. And in the second wave of attack, the Second World War, they want to completely foil this plan. And that's when we see Sri Aurobindo to make sure that the Yajna is prepared. That's how we can understand he gave his own body ultimately. Because he didn't want this foundation to be weak. So they come, all the forces from the inconscient, subconscious, even the disciples that time. You see at one point Sri Aurobindo says that if they want, because other things started coming up, India's alliance with Britain, Germany, all these things were happening. A kind of idealism. It was a time when Asuric Maya was at its peak. If you read the letters during that time, one can see how the Asuric Maya was at its peak, even creating a division of different kinds. And Sri Aurobindo has to patiently write. At one point he says, if you want me to close the ashram, just tell me that. I will close the ashram myself. Because they were not able to understand that this was one of the most deceptive. First World War, there was all this hegemony and ambition. But the Second World War was fought on the grounds of utter falsehood and deception. So we see Hitler rising using Arya, swastika, Superman, all these symbols he took up, which were divine symbols. The word Arya he corrupted, swastik he corrupted. All that. He wanted his own way to unite the world. But by exterminating, Superman had to come, the superior ones. So all these we see were corrupted by some of these nations. It was fought on the ground of falsehood and deception. That's why we see in the First World War, Sri Aurobindo doesn't directly intervene this way. He intervenes with his forces. But the Second World War, it's utter falsehood which has come out. And that's when we see, and cruelty to its nadir, all those things. And then Sri Aurobindo intervenes, and there we see at a point of time when he says, we will see. And that starts changing the tide of the war. And then he plunges into that final yajna ahuti. The yajna is going on, but all these forces have come and covered the flame with smoke and poison of hatred. The entire old world order was broken at that point of time. That's why you see after that, different kind of thought process started. So who will offer as the foundation? So we have this story in the Puranas, Vishnu's 10 avatars. So one of them is Kurma avatar. So it's very interesting that ocean has a base, but God becomes Kurma to have become the base. Ocean has a base, you could put Sumeru, but it started going deeper and deeper, and that foundation is endless. So somebody had to become that base on which the new creation can be built. That's why we see after 44, 45, on one side, the mother starts preparing the physical base. That's when the physical education department starts and all this, children come. At the same time, mother describes this very interestingly. She says, he saw that the world is not ready. He saw that man is not ready. He saw that human beings, when they have a choice, they gravitate toward the inconscient and the subconscient. They side with the asura when they have the freedom. So Sri Aurobindo, and then she says, but he didn't blame humanity. See, that is a sign of the greatest of the great. He didn't blame humanity. Though it is lack of receptivity of mankind, he himself plunged into the inconscient to seal that whole thing. And then when he enters, plunges into the inconscient, now he gives that solid base. At the same time, we see a similar action taking place while during the First World War. This is so significant for us practically. So during the First World War, we see Sri Aurobindo is releasing idea forces of Arya into this world. And he started Savitri, though it came in fullness after 27, went through a phase. Then during Second World War, the life divine and Savitri, once again he is releasing. And then when Savitri is complete, he knows that this is the fire that can sustain the rest of the mantra has been given for the yajna, because every yajna has a mantra. He gives his own life as an offering, the Purna Ahuti. It was a yajna which demanded a complete divine kingdom upon earth, and it needed a Purna Ahuti. Something similar probably took place during the time of Rama, when Sita goes back to earth. It is not the way it is portrayed, a very sad, tragic event. But she saw that world is not ready for the union of the divine soul and nature. So she actually plunges with all that consciousness back into earth. She has impregnated the earth with those seeds. They were to bear fruit one day. And so we see that Sri Aurobindo, mother wanted to do the same thing, exactly repeat the act of the Sita. She said, if one of us is to go, I'll go. Sri Aurobindo says, no. This was going to be a repeat story. He said, no, you will not go. I'll depart. and he goes and creates a base. Now you see this, when we look at it as a yajna, how different it is when we say, oh, Sri Aurobindo left his body, he left the work incomplete. There were people who even spoke about physical illness, things like that. And the mother had to issue that time a very, because she is not, she said Sri Aurobindo is a perfect gentleman, he will not say. But she, so beautifully, there is nothing mortal about Sri Aurobindo. So with all that fire, he takes a plunge. You know something very interesting, of course, we all know that not only the body was aglow, later on, toward the end, that fluid which starts coming out from the body had the smell of lotus. And Sumantra Dao was there in Desiree. He still had it in his hands because he was one of the persons who had carried. But more interestingly, when Udarda said, Mother, I like to believe that Sri Aurobindo's body will not undergo what usually the bodies undergo as the disintegration process. So I want it to be arranged like that. And she said yes. So, because this is a question people ask, she has even said yes to that. His body will not undergo that process. And therefore the body was kept in a casket, and she wrote what she wrote because he struggled, suffered and achieved, because it was a result of this last Holocaust, this great sacrifice which is described in Savitri. Lo, it is finished, the dread mysterious sacrifice of God's martyred body into this world. And then we see that the flames that rose up, out of those flames the new creation is born on 29th February 1956. Of course, the mother carried the yoga much further. That's a different story altogether, because she, out of her infinite love, the work was over. She wanted to take it to the utmost. And Sri Aurobindo in Record of Yoga had said 56-57 as the year of fulfillment. He had also said passingly in a letter, a decisive stage from 4, 5, 6, 7. And we see 69, 1st January, the Superman descended. And then after the new body, she departs. That's a different thing. I mean, we can't use the word departs. Whatever process, transformation could take place. But there is a lesson and a message for us in this entire life of Sri Aurobindo. Our life should also become a yajna. So the first thing, people often ask how to live, this life of sadhana and yoga. So the first thing that we see is, don't try to become a yogi, a superman and all that. There is a letter of Sri Aurobindo. That's not the way to take the yoga, because there is too much of ego in it. Live only to serve the divine, live in the divine, live for the divine. This is the first lesson we get. At least for something larger, and whatever may be, like people who want to live for the nation, yes, but only for the sake of the divine manifestation. Otherwise, we'll end up creating a national ego. That's not what we want. But the nation for serving the divine will in this world. That's why it's important. The rise of India, the greatness of India, which Sri Aurobindo has said. So this is how we should, orient ourselves. Otherwise, we will end up, there are a lot of people, nationalism can be of a very aggressive, asuric kind, or it can be very Devic kind. And Sri Aurobindo says nationalism is an important step. And a nation is being formed in India, a new and young nation. 100 years back, he has written this. 110 years back. Reads like he's writing today. But not for its own greatness alone. You must have greatness, because that's how splendor and everything. But the recovery of the lost knowledge for the sake of the world. Then we see his life as an example. So when he is asked, how can we serve, what we should do? He says, recover the Aryan spirit, not just in thought, but in speech and life and actions. It's not enough to just read Sri Aurobindo. Oh, that itself is a big step, the Gyan Yajna. But to try to live even a little of that teaching, not to live for oneself at all. I mean, this is yoga. Even the idea, when people would ask the mother, how am I progressing? And she would say, this is the problem. You are still thinking of your progress, your experiences, what I have experienced. I want to experience. So all these things, we immediately see Sri Aurobindo never said, I want to experience like that. He says, I want to see God for the sake of this world. His entire yoga is for the sake of earth and humanity, or serving the divine in the human and through the human. To make ourselves a bridge. And for that, there is no offering which can be enough. That's why the mother insists on self-giving. So we see that these stages of, yajna, where one first is, of course, the most selfish. That's a non-qualifier. People who live only for their separate satisfaction. They're not ready even for the yoga. Then one desires, but sacrifice, then takes the fruits of desire, as desires, fulfillment of this and that. That's a relation we can form with Sri Aurobindo and the mother, but that's not really yoga. But when we offer and give ourselves to the divine for the sake of the divine, this is the real start of the yogic journey, which we see epitomized in Sri Aurobindo and the mother's life so beautifully. And so completely he could renounce realization in his own body for the sake of the collective realization. This is very beautiful as an end point. Let me just read something. So this is, he says in the Karma Yogin with regard to India. The genius of self-sacrifice is not common to all nations and to all individuals. It is rare and precious. It is the flowering of mankind's ethical growth, the evidence of our gradual rise from the self-regarding animal to the selfless divinity. The path is hewn by sacrifice. Perhaps this was the reason Mother says there are many people who are alive but they are dead, because they are living only for themselves. A man capable of self-sacrifice, whatever his other sins, has left the animal behind him. He has the stuff in him of a future and higher humanity. So, how we prepare ourselves for being even a candidate? At one place he speaks about who is a candidate for Superman. All who are trying to control themselves, master themselves, are a candidate for supermanhood. A nation capable of a national act of self-sacrifice ensures its future. Self-sacrifice, involuntary or veiled by forms of selfishness, is, however, the condition of our existence. Then he describes all the different kinds of sacrifice. And the other one, which he speaks of as participants in the cosmic yajna. So Sri Aurobindo is, see, it's very interesting line in Savitri. The sacrifice of earth she offers suffering and desire to the immortal ecstasy began once again beneath the eternal's hand. So ordinarily also nature is sacrificing. All our desires, thoughts, everything, we think that it is ours, but they are being carried by nature and offered to the Lord. And He gives what He chooses to give to us. We may desire, we may not desire, it's really irrelevant. At the end of the day, we will receive as prasad whatever comes. And it is never meant for one person. It will always be whatever we have given goes to the one, comes from the one, and is shared by this entire creation. We may like it, we don't. Even in death, there is this sacrifice. Things go back to their different places, different elements. So whether we like it or not, it's extracted of us. But when we do consciously, then we are on the royal road to the divine. So he says, the law of sacrifice, the giving of oneself, or of what one envisages as belonging to oneself. So he is qualifying, because many people say, but mera to kuch nahi hai, okay, fine. But you believe it is yours, so it's okay. In a spirit of love and devotion, that's the second part. It's not like I am giving, now I'll offer my hairs, but I want diamonds for my purse. That's not sacrifice. That's bargain. Sri Aurobindo would say, that's why when people came to yoga, the first conversation of the mother is about this sacrifice. Light up the fire of aspiration. And then she says, That what do you want the yoga for? To help humanity? For yourself? None of these is a qualifier for the yoga. When you want the yoga for the sake of the divine, divine for the sake of the divine, then it's a beginning. So, wanting the divine for the sake of the divine, it's only logical. What else is worth wanting? And when you have the divine. So, anyways, he reminds us it should be done in a spirit of love and devotion, not like a mechanical thing, not like a dehadi ka mazduri, 6 hours work. It's done with as an act of love. That's why in one of the conversations, Mother says we don't talk about renunciation in this yoga. So everywhere there is talk of renunciation. Why you don't say? It says if you have this feeling that you are renouncing something and it is pinching you, it's no more of any value. There is one place where she says something even more powerful. It's like an admonition. If you remember what you have given to the divine, then the divine will not have the need to remember it. If you remember what you have given to the divine, then the divine will have no need to remember it. Then it is to your own ego and vanity that you have offered and not to the divine. I am the giver. Somebody had asked that I want to give money for Golkund, but I want my name to be put on a slab of stone. And Mother says, okay, put it on the floor with the name. Now nobody likes that, no? Everybody wants some prominent place, not on the floor where people will step. They had their own way. Somebody gave some money and asked Sri Aurobindo, Dravyagya. That's how she says in the prayers and meditation. It's about sacrifice. Some give their money, some give their life, some give all of themselves, some give their soul to the divine. There are some who give everything. They are the true children of God. Others who give nothing, whatever their value in the outer world are for the divine purposes, valueless ciphers. So, somebody gave to Sri Aurobindo, offered something, say, I want this money to be used in this way. So he asks, what should we do? Sri Aurobindo says, accept the money, reject the suggestions. What kind of offering is this? Accept the money, reject the suggestions. It's not easy to be able to give to the divine. There is that another story where somebody gave money to Mother, and the Mother with a red pen struck off the check and said not accepted. What was the reason we don't know. Not accepted. Whereas there is another where a beggar, not a beggar but a very poor man who has not met the Mother but heard about her. And she says, I have heard so much about your mother that I feel like giving something to her. Please carry this 1 rupee. And the disciples came and gave it to the Mother. Mother went into a trance holding it. She said, the divine will find it difficult to repay this. The divine will find it difficult. This act of giving and how the divine values it. We have that other story where there is a minister who is waiting in the queue for darshan and the mother is busy with the child. Something has fallen on the frock and she is cleaning and all this. And the disciples said, Mother, there was a minister who was waiting, he has gone away. He was so restless. He says, yes, but this child has given herself to me. So completely the divine gives himself when we give to the divine. So that's the joyous sacrifice, loving sacrifice. It's not giving with the idea of I am the giver, I am giving. So he reminds us. And we see this in Sri Aurobindo's own life. With sacrifice as their companion, says the Gita, the All-Father created these peoples. Sacrifice is the practical recognition by the ego that it is neither alone in the world nor chief in the world, and that in that which is not its egoistic self, there is something greater, completer, which demands from it subordination and service. Sacrifice is compelled by nature. But if the sacrifice is done unconsciously, egoistically, without knowledge or acceptance of the true meaning of the great world right, it produces only mechanical effects or a painful progress for the individual It is only when the heart, the will, and the knowledge associate themselves with the law that there comes the real joy and fruitfulness of sacrifice. The knowledge that it is done as an offering to the divine for the sake of the divine. Then it bears really. And then, do we have to abandon people in our life? He reminds us, not for the sake of the wife is the wife dear to us, says Yagivalk in the Upanishad, but for the sake of the self. And while this is true in a lower sense of egoistic love, it is equally true in a higher sense of the love which is not egoistic. So he takes it to the next level. All love and all sacrifice are in their essence nature's contradiction of the primary egoism. And then toward the end, he says, what we have to really sacrifice. This profound idea of sacrifice is the basis of the teaching in the Gita. It is from the synthesis of yoga. We can see at once that it differs from the ordinary idea in as much as its essence is not self-immolation and its tendency is to discourage self-mortification, self-torture, self-mutilation and self-effacement. So that's why people who didn't understand, they still have the old idea of sannyas. So they asked the mother, why is she wearing nice saris? Why she has put a lipstick or a perfume? And imagine the mother had to explain to such wonderful disciples that, well, somebody gives me, I receive it and accept it as part of his love. And what she would do? She would wear it and give it away, thanks to those number of saris, chappals. I think here also we have such a wonderful collection. All this was for posterity. She was leaving it for all of us. People would give her chappal. She would, no, I don't wear chappal. Look at the difference. Sannyasi would say, no, I don't. I walk on floor. But on the floor you must put leaves so that I don't step on the earth but step on leaves. That's what Surendra Johar had once told one of these Naga sannyasis, that everything is fine, your talk on detachment, but you are too attached to your detachment. So sacrifice none of these things. It's such a joyous giving. Here she was touching everything. And with that benediction, she has given it as gifts to the world. Sri Aurobindo gives this example of a king touching and turning it into a nazrana. You see, when people brought to the king would look at it. They would uncover, king will touch it and say, give it to the praja. So everything that came, if you look at Sri Aurobindo and the mother, they didn't use anything for themselves. The mother's life, even more, she didn't even have a room for herself. So when we read their life, it's something so amazing. But the Gita discourages this path. What is that path? These things may be temporarily necessary when the egoism is violent and obstinate and has to be met by a sort of answering internal violence and repression. But the Gita discourages this path. The self within is really the God himself. It is Krishna. It is the divine, and it has not to be troubled and tortured as the titans of the world trouble and torture themselves, but to be fostered and cherished. What has to be discouraged, expelled, slain is the band of its enemies, desire, wrath, inequality, the attachment to outward pleasures and pains, which are the cause of its errors and sufferings. The nature of sacrifice is self-giving, not self-immolation. Its object is not self-effacement, but self-fulfillment. So we see that typically, because many times people ask, that, always we are very impressed. Somebody went to Himalaya and came back after 10 years of doing some sadhana. He left his wife, children, everything. Incidentally, this is another aspect. Sri Aurobindo did not leave anybody. You see, this is another misconception. He left his wife and went. No, he didn't do that. He came at the behest of an inner command. This is the seat of tapasya. But always it was understood that she may come and join him. And in fact, when she was coming to join him, that is the time when on the way she had malaria and she died. That's a different story altogether, the divine plan. But he did not leave outwardly, but inwardly we see even the highest ideals of that time, he was hailed as the national hero. And yet, because there is something greater, something higher, something more beautiful. So, this is the inspiration we get from Sri Aurobindo's life. May we make our own life a constant sacrifice to the eternal. This is the message and the beautiful thing we get from Sri Aurobindo's life as an example. God's own example, as he says in the Gita, he says it is so important. What was God's own example? In the Gita's context, Shri Krishna tells Arjuna, there is nothing which I have to gain for myself, and yet I engage myself in the path of action, because if I were not to do it, the world would collapse. So we have the example of Sri Aurobindo's life as a yogi, as a priest of the sacrifice, and all of us, there is a head priest, and all of us become Chinna priest. But Chinna priest to become, we have to find the psychic being. Until we do that, because it is the priest within us, until we do that, we'll always be moving in the circles of enlarging egoism. This is the Indian way of life, Indian conception. So, all other ideals we have to leave aside at this altar, at this flame, light up the flame, make our body and life the house of sacrifice to the eternal. That is the path they have shown by their own life as an example. Yes, so I'll use the Indian terms for that. I get that sense. There are two things, Nigraha and Sanyama. Self control is Sanyama. Nigraha is forced suppression, which Sri Krishna says in the Gita. How will coercion? Of course, the mother said that you can't do it. She gave the way of offering, neither of them. She gave the way that offering. Sri Aurobindo used the word rejection. Rejection is different from suppression or repression. Suppression is fine still, but repression, because repression means that we are not even conscious of what is entering us. But either rejection or offering is done when we become conscious. So there is a difference. When we consciously control an impulse, then yes, we have taken a step higher, definitely. But the right way to control is through Sanyama first. There is a very beautiful essay of his in Essays Divine and Human, and it's called The Process of Evolution. And Sri Aurobindo precisely talks about that if you try Nigraha in the beginning, it violently backlashes. Then some people try self-immolation. That's what he was referring. But even there he says band of enemies. So let's take one thing. Let's take one of the biggest problems in mankind, lust and fear. Or fear is the greatest impurity, but fear is something of a different order. Lust. So what does one do? That's why Sanyama, which is called regulated, sublimated. Sublimated by, that's why you see in ashrams he created such wonderful, so many physical activities. So that you are so busy and occupied with it. It's not that one doesn't observe it, but one starts, it becomes much easier to reject. But she is not advising us to go into guilt. There are people, I know yogis who take medicines to finish a certain instinct. That's an unnatural way. Or sannyasis who will completely isolate themselves into, they will dry the senses. Typical example is Dilip Kumar Roy, where he was, see, they come from the Indriya and it's seeking for pleasure. If you go to its root, the organ of pleasure is of course in the mind, but through the Indriyas. So that's where he spoke about these things, that if you suppress it the way Nigraha, then you dry it up completely. But when you practice Sanyama and keep offering it, so there is a very fine kind of a, if I may use the word, like a laser surgery, precise surgery. Yes, of course, there is no indulgence. But at the same time, if there is indulgence, it's not guilt. It's a very thin line that one passes through. Because guilt saps the energy. Knowing human nature, what it is. See, that's why many things in the ashram are so difficult to understand. There is no indulgence in it, that's right. But if, because human nature is such, so that's why they left certain things. If you read through the letters, very interesting. That's why they never gave such a strong do's and don'ts list, because human beings will go into the other aspect of guilt and all that. So one offers and keeps on exercising Sanyama. Let's say Let's take the sexual impulse, okay? Let's take the bull by the head. So one is led to a point of indulgence. Let me put it like that. The impulse has almost overpowered. Even while you are indulging, keep offering it and think of the divine. This there is a letter of Eleanor Montgomery where she writes to Sri Aurobindo that how come during this act I had an experience of the self, because she was precisely trying that. So what will happen is the mind which takes the pleasure, that is something you can still turn, and after some time you'll see how it goes. It becomes more and more mechanical, and then finally it goes away from the system because the mind and the vital have stopped giving any assent to it, but mechanically habitually it will continue. Then when we stop giving an assent, habitually it may come back. It becomes very weak actually, then it becomes easy to nigra. But even when one doesn't, it goes into the environmental consciousness of the subconscious and has a tendency to come up in dreams, and then eventually it will go away. This is the process. It's not like Nigraha that today onwards I will master. One Shukdev, yes, but not all are Shukdev. So we have to understand that. It's a process. That's why in Indian thought you have the concept of graduality. Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Shubindu speaks about that. Okay, so thank you.